Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Robert Strauss Center's International Security Speaker Series. I'm Eugene Gholz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, and I organize the series. But I'm very grateful to our co-sponsors, the Robert Strauss Center and our fearless director, Frank Gavin, over there, and the LBJ Presidential Library, which offers us this lovely facility. And Tina Houston is the deputy director, and she's here, and so we're very grateful for their support for this series. And as I mentioned before in my little preview, we're a little later getting started this season or this year. You guys may have noticed there's been a little bit of tumult around here, some renovations and plazas getting turned upside down. But now that we're on track, we have a whole series over the rest of the academic year. There are 6 more of these things scheduled, and I hope that you will keep coming and keep going back to the Strauss Center website to get information about them. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I will flog the next one is 2 weeks from tonight, November 19th, with Daniel Dresner, who's a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts and one of the leading, so he's a very smart guy and he's interested in a lot of interesting questions, but he's best known in public for being one of the leading foreign affairs bloggers out there. So DanielDresner.com used to be a go-to place, but now he's on foreignpolicy.com. He's moved his blog, so once they established their kind of regular rotation. And he's a pretty interesting guy. He's going to be talking about China and whether they get any coercive leverage and threaten American security because they buy all our treasury bills. And that should be a pretty good topic. So coming up in 2 weeks from tonight. Hope to see you there. Tonight, though, we've got a great talk planned, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Celeste Ward, as I believe what it says on the announcement. Celeste Ward Gventer is her full and proper name, but she was Celeste Ward at the time that we invited her. So I'm going to stick to that. Celeste is now a senior analyst at the Rand Corporation, which is, many of you know, I guess, in this building, the LBJ Library. LBJ meant to have many ties to the Rand Corporation, so it may be familiar, but insider think tank, really in the classic sense of really smart people go there to think and advise on the inside of government. But before that, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability Operations Capabilities for 2 years. Immediately before that, and before that, she did 2 tours in Iraq, one as the political advisor to General Corelli, and one working for the Coalition Provisional Authority, helping to set up or organize what became the Ministry of Defense for the country of Iraq. So all of this experience gives her a wealth of knowledge and background, and to talk about tonight's topic, which is her smart thinking on our counterinsurgency strategy and whether it's really a good idea to have that as our national strategy. And without further ado, Celeste Ward.
Great, thank you very much. Should I talk about that one?
Yeah.
Either is okay. Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, great.
Well, do you want just the lavalier? You were.
The lavalier's feeding the speakers here.
Okay, so you don't need the other one.
I'm double tapping there. Okay, great. Good evening to you all. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I just want to thank Eugene Gholz and the LBJ School and the Strauss Center and the library for having me here tonight, and I look forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion with you. I thought I would, since advisors to generals seem to be everywhere these days, I wanted to give you a sense just really quickly of what that meant in my case. When I was the advisor to General Corelli, he was the overall operational commander in Iraq. So that meant he was in charge of the forces in the whole theater. And General Casey was his boss, but Corelli was a 3-star. And so we traveled all over Iraq and went to every outpost, every military facility that we had several times, and went out into cities, Fallujah, Mosul, Tal Afar, Baghdad, and talked to Iraqis. And so I was very privileged to get a great perspective and a great view on that conflict in 2006, which turned out to be a rather seminal year. And as Eugene pointed out, my next job was in the Pentagon, where I oversaw the policy portfolio on some of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. And I suppose this, in a sense, makes me a bit of a defector. But part of what formed my views was precisely the experience I had in the Pentagon and how that did, and in many cases did not, comport with my direct experience in Iraq. So I look forward to your thoughts and questions on these issues. So let me just start with my main subject here. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the theory and doctrine of counterinsurgency, known as COIN, have been ascendant in defense and military circles. And this may be a gross understatement. Hardly a day goes by in Washington when a conference is not being held to debate and discuss counterinsurgency theory and precepts. Blogs devoted to COIN pulsate with discussion and debate. Whole think tanks have emerged whose primary emphasis is exactly this issue. And news programs rotate into their broadcasts a passel of counterinsurgency experts, self-styled or otherwise. And it's become really the overwhelming framework of choice for understanding not just the wars we're in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the wars of the future. And very much the current zeitgeist of the national security community, and I would argue a worldview. But as the saying goes, where there is unanimity, there may be cowardice or uncritical thinking. COIN has become so prevalent that it is now bordering on dogma, risks obscuring our thinking on current problems, and distracts us from some of the fundamental strategic questions that the United States needs to face. In short, it's been taken too far. And the uncritical and misguided perception of the success of counterinsurgency in Iraq is fueling many of these misconceptions, and I believe provides a dangerous illusion concerning the limits of American power. Counterinsurgency has really become a strategy, and one that implies vast expenditure of US blood and treasure for a spectacularly ambitious project to change entire societies. And I think this strategy is deeply unwise and could have significant deleterious consequences for US power and position over the long term. Now, if I was really from the Pentagon, I would have a whole bunch of slides to show you, but I decided to depart from that and actually just give you some remarks. So I think we need to start by discussing why did COIN rise to the prominence that it did? And then maybe go into what are some of the problems with this theory and why is this such a concern that it is risen to such prominence? And then challenge some of the intellectual bases for it. And I want to end with some discussion of the need for a sound US strategy that departs significantly from this counterinsurgency framework. So first, how did we get here? I'm not sure I can pinpoint a precise time frame, but counterinsurgency theory really reemerged when violence in Iraq started to increase in 2003 and 2004. And actually the term got politicized almost immediately because the Bush administration was critiqued by its opponents on the left that an insurgency had begun in Iraq, and I don't know if you remember this, but the administration said, no, this is not an insurgency. But I would submit to you that was not so much a disagreement over the substance of the definition of insurgency than it was over whether the violence had reached a certain level or not. And the administration, I think, was reluctant to say that the violence had in fact reached that limit where it could suddenly be referred to as a movement. But eventually they did relent, and insurgency then became the framework for the discussion of events in Iraq. And so as time went on, academics and policymakers set about unearthing all of the historical materials on counterinsurgency, and the community began generally occupying itself with the study of counterinsurgency, holding conferences. Blogs were actually started specifically devoted to this issue that still exists today. And old tomes of counterinsurgency and great names such as David Galula and others who wrote in the 1960s about the French conflict in Algeria reemerged. And in fact, some books were reissued because they were in such high demand. Now by 2005, 2006, the violence got quite significant in Iraq, particularly after the bombing of the Shia mosque in Samarra. I was there. This was February 2006, and violence really escalated rather rapidly after that. So the debate shifted at that point to, well, was Iraq having a civil war or not? And so for many months, the administration then resisted the term civil war, and others charged that, in fact, that was what was going on. By the time I left Iraq at the end of 2006, we didn't really talk about counterinsurgency, and in fact, I argued that we shouldn't talk about it in that way because I didn't think it was apt, and I still don't, and I'll get into that. Sometimes we just called it a perfect storm, because really, in a sense, that's what it was. But then by December of 2006, two really important things happened. First, the Army published, with great fanfare and publicity, including appearances on The Daily Show, the Army and Marine Corps' new counterinsurgency doctrinal manual known as Field Manual, or FM 324. And the next thing that happened is the Bush administration made a decision to change its approach in Iraq and appointed a new commander, General David Petraeus, whose signature is on the opening pages of FM 324, because at that time he was the commander of the Army's Combined Arms Center, the organization that writes doctrine. And so at this point, these three things come together: the change of approach in Iraq and the surge, the appointment of General Petraeus, and the publication of FM 324. And it happens in a very short time period. And so thus begins the surge. The surge is the shorthand term, as I'm sure you all know, used to describe several changes to our approach in Iraq that began in early 2007, including an infusion of several thousand more US troops. It is widely reputed to be an example of both an implementation of FM 324 and of successful counterinsurgency. But I'm afraid this is a highly stylized, mythologized, and oversimplified account of history. The reality is that the framework of counterinsurgency emerged due to a historical path dependency of politics and personality, and less because of its aptness for describing the situation in Iraq. But despite this, the perceived success of the surge in Iraq is one of the most significant factors behind the ascendance of coin theory, so it deserves close scrutiny. And that's what I just want to divert a little bit into Iraq and then try to bring it back to where we are today. So by early 2007, there were at least 5 conflicts raging in Iraq simultaneously. There were anti-occupation forces, people who were fighting us because we were there. And there were large Sunni elements of that and also Shia elements of that. There was an enormous inter-ethno-sectarian struggle for power and influence among Iraq's competing groups. An aspect of this was an anti-Iraqi government struggle, which might fit into traditional notions of an insurgency. But that was one small piece of what was going on. There were intra-sectarian struggles for power. So within the different groups, they were actually competing with each other. This is particularly true of the Shia, where there were many groups who were trying to compete for ascendance among its compatriots. There was Al-Qaeda exploiting chaos and Sunni fear and discontent of the Shia. But I will tell you that by 2006, 2007, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was 99% Iraqis, not foreigners. Also, there was really what ultimately amounts to a proxy conflict with Iran at this stage. I think you could add in a few other dynamics to this mix, and I'm sure there's many that I won't even name. But as Douglas Ollivant, a retired Army lieutenant colonel and very good analyst, this is a transition from a totalitarian regime, and that might be actually the framework that we should be using, because that had enormous implications. The rise of Shiism, which had been subjugated under Saddam Hussein for so many years, and other regional political dynamics. These were all at play simultaneously within Iraq's borders. And these conflicts were interwoven and intermingled with various factions finding common cause, and it was really a honeycomb of interests and capabilities. Now, the conflicts were also inside the Iraqi government itself. So the government reflected and represented those competitions. So rather than being a government and then outsiders attempting to overthrow that government, it was all woven together. And this is one reason why the official definition of insurgency, which is an organized movement aimed at the overthrow of government through the use of subversion and armed conflict, hardly begins to cover the situation in Iraq in 2006 and 7, and frankly, even today. But notwithstanding, some will argue that irrespective of that, the surge was a success, and it ended as an example of the implementation of FM 324. But as always, the truth is more complicated than that. Aspects of the surge actually did have, were prescribed in the manual in FM 324, but in other ways it departed significantly from it. And we can talk about this more in discussion, but let me just give you one example of that. The manual says that to bring security to a region, you need 20 counterinsurgent forces for every 1,000 population, 1,000 people in the population. So that's the appropriate ratio to provide security. So if the population of Iraq is 25 million, and this is everybody's best estimate, there's really no good census, but it's about that. Then if you were to implement the prescription in the manual, you would need about 500,000 troops. And we never even had 200,000 at the height of the surge. So we never even came close to the prescription of FM 324 in that regard. If you take only Baghdad, a city of approximately 7.5 million, and again, the numbers are a little fuzzy, but that's probably about right, then you would need 150,000, which is about what we had in the whole country. So now adherents to the theory will say, well, yes, but you're only counting US forces and you're not counting Iraqi forces. And if you count the Iraqis, then you get close to the ratio. But I think this is a stretch, especially given the capability and reliability of the Iraqi forces even at that stage. So by the way, if you do this calculation for Afghanistan, you are talking about 500 to 600,000 counterinsurgent forces. Even if you added Afghans to that, we'd never even come close. So that's just one example of the prescriptions in FM 324 were really not followed very closely in the surge. And so it's just important to note that this really wasn't an implementation of 324 except in a few very specific regards, and even then, not sure. However, toward the end of 2007, violence begins to subside in Iraq. So why? Well, my view is that we should try to have a little bit of humility about our ability to apprehend causality in a complex situation like Iraq. There's a great quote from a philosopher, English philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. He says, "Levers of power produce effects unsystematically and too often only coincidentally related to the effects of which their user boasts." The fact is, in these incredibly complex situations, knowing the effect that any particular policy or any particular thing that you're doing is having on the ground is extremely difficult to predict. But yet, in the ex-post analysis of the surge, there's a lot of apparent certainty about what caused what. But several dynamics were already underway that can at least partially explain the reduction in violence in Iraq after the surge that really had not much to do with the surge itself. For years, the Marines in the West had been trying to bring the Sunnis to the table. They had been negotiating with various sheikhs and tribal leaders and trying to get them to stop attacking US forces. And finally, these efforts started to bear fruit. Toward the end of 2006, they were already coming around. And this really became a widespread phenomenon with the so-called awakening in 2007. And many of them agreed to stop attacking us in exchange for receiving pay. That's an important point. They were being paid. The Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army declared a ceasefire, but this is likely due to internal dynamics among Iraq's Shia factions. And to a large degree, the mixed neighborhoods of Baghdad that used to be Sunni Shia and in fact small populations of Christians had mostly gone to one group or the other. And so by even when I left in late 2006, the Sunnis and Shia had separated themselves. And they were already on opposite sides of the river, and the mixed neighborhoods had almost entirely gone away. So the civil war or the conflict among these groups may have been ready to burn itself out in any event. Another important point is that the Iraqi government in 2007 finally began allowing operations into areas of Baghdad that they had previously resisted. So in 2005, 2006, U.S. forces typically did not go into Sadr City or certain areas of Sadr City to get some of the most nefarious characters among the Shia militias. And this changed in 2007, and that allowed us to get some of the worst characters. Our intelligence improved, various technical improvements were made to provide intelligence to units, and a variety of other things happened. I think it's also worth noting that many of the techniques that are touted as having been decisive during the surge were actually already being employed before the surge happened. So if you listen to sort of the surge narrative, the story goes, before 2007, we were going around ham-fistedly killing people, and we were alienating them because we were just killing these brutes, barbarians, and then finally the heroes rode in on the white horses, and they stopped doing that and developed a subtler approach. The fact is that commanders on the ground had been doing all sorts of things to assist the population prior to the surge. We had built many schools, many sewage treatment plants, many factories, electrical lines, you name it, well prior to that. So it's just simply not true that the approach changed radically between those two different time periods. So again, causality is a little tricky here. I think from a strategic point of view, it's worth noting that the surge really didn't change our fundamental conundrum in Iraq at all, which is playing out now before our eyes. So the reconciliation that was supposed to occur between Iraqi groups, now remember the surge was supposed to provide time and space for the Iraqis to make up and find a way to deal with one another. But that really never happened. And the Iraqis remain in conflict with one another, as we can see with a number of recent events, for largely the same reasons that they were in 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008. And that will likely persist for some time. There are several very critical issues in Iraq that have yet to be resolved. The borders of Kurdistan are a significant irritant among the Arabs and the Kurds. And the status of the city of Kirkuk, those things still haven't been resolved, and they're coming. And so counterinsurgency doctrine and theory couldn't change the fact that our putative allies, the Iraqi government, represented the various sides of a raging ethno-sectarian conflict, that outside powers were and are playing an enormous role in the outcomes, and that cash payments, not culturally sensitive negotiation, or the application of any particular set of tactics was one of the most significant contributors to the end of violence in 2007, or the reduction in violence. So these considerations have been out there now for a long time, but don't seem to have affected the triumphalist, exultant rhetoric concerning the perceived success of the surge. A documentary soon to be released declares that it will, quote, tell the ground truth of a failing mission transformed into one of the most successful military operations in a generation of warfighting. Okay. Institute for the Study of War. It'll be released on November 9th, I believe. That was the press associated with the press announcement associated with that documentary. So that sounds balanced. But to some degree, though, this is understandable. So myth and narrative are tools to understand the world and situate oneself and one's society. So the answer that it's complicated or we're not quite sure why things happened doesn't make for a very compelling narrative. And I recognize that. Ironically, FM 324 itself points to the importance of narrative. It has a paragraph on it here, a very short paragraph. It says, the central mechanism through which ideologies are expressed and absorbed is the narrative. A narrative is an organizational scheme expressed in story form. Narratives are central to the representation of identity, particularly the collective identity of groups such as religions, nations, and cultures. Stories about a community's history provide models of how actions and consequences are linked and are often the basis for strategies, actions, and interpretations of the intentions of other actors. So yes, indeed. And I would argue that FM 324 and counterinsurgency are itself a narrative that fits this description rather well. But it's my view that policy should not be made in story form. So what does all this mean? The persistence of the mythology associated with the surge is leading us to attempt the application of the same techniques in Afghanistan, and even to discussions that coin represents the future of warfare. You can see this in a number of statements from administration officials and outside commentators. And despite a number of protestations that Iraq is not Afghanistan, the reality is that we are precisely in the act of extrapolating these widely held assumptions about events in Iraq and applying them to Afghanistan. Even the language of surge is the same. And you note that the president is supposedly choosing between counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, as if these are two wholly distinct categories of activity that can be separated into these two approaches. In fact, just this morning, there was an Agence France-Presse story saying that Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that while we must be careful in applying lessons from Iraq to Afghanistan, it is reasonable to use Iraq as a model. So it's undeniable that Iraq is providing a significant example to people who want to implement these things in Afghanistan. Okay, well, so what's so wrong with COIN? I would say that there's a first-order question concerning COIN theory and doctrine, and that's the impact of devising typologies of warfare. So this is kind of an academic question, but it's a problem when we take those typologies and try to derive lessons and even specific tactics, techniques, and procedures devoid of historical context. As Barry Posen and Steve Metz argue, 21st century insurgency is not a variant of war, but rather part of systemic failure and pathology. I'm not arguing for eliminating doctrine or the practice of identifying generalizable lessons, but we have to be constantly attentive to the risk that such groupings obscure more than they illuminate. Generalizations are helpful when they show you something new and they help you understand a problem. They're dangerous when they obscure detail, and I think that may be happening here. And this is more likely to be true when we're dealing with internal conflicts that have a strong historical and cultural dimension. These are about entire societies, rather than, say, a technical dimension only. So this is about a whole culture and a whole history, not how to defeat a tank formation. So it's my view that conflicts are, to some degree, of course, they're sui generis. They have their own characters, motive forces, qualities, and are situated in very specific historical and strategic contexts, and those facts are relevant to the outcomes. I mean, this might be something that we might talk about in a classroom here or in some other university, but these unexamined assumptions are now being applied to a major U.S. national security priority or multiple priorities. The dominance of counterinsurgency also has led many analysts to now use the term to describe any type of internal conflict throughout history. So what we used to call, say, tribal warfare or rebellion, or internal rivalries, or a peace operation, will now receive the label of counterinsurgency. So every small war or imperial war of history now fits into this artificial category, and one can assume is therefore susceptible to the generalized techniques and procedures of counterinsurgency doctrine. So first and foremost, it's not clear that insurgency fits in Afghanistan. While there certainly are organized movements seeking to overthrow the government in Kabul, it goes well beyond that. So Matthew Ho, the former Marine and State Department official who recently resigned his post in Afghanistan, he says in his resignation letter, "I fail to see the value or the worth in continued U.S. casualties or expenditures of resources in support of the Afghan government in what is truly a 35-year-old civil war." So, here's somebody who spent a lot of time on the ground and spent a lot of time studying Afghan history, and his conclusion is this is not about insurgency, this is about rivalries and competitions among the Afghans themselves. But the proper application of terminology is more than academic. So let me give you a couple of examples of how this rampant misapplication of coin theory could actually lead you in the wrong direction. So one of the key precepts of coin theory, I mean, it's really a foundational tenet, is that you're there to help strengthen and underwrite the legitimacy of the host government. But what if the host government is part of the problem? Or if they're not a government that it's in US interest to support? I would offer that Iraq is most certainly in that category. And now the response to this tends to be, well, we must urge these partners to be better and be less corrupt, and we must train them, and we must try to persuade them to share our interests. But I don't know about you, that's not an approach that inspires much confidence. We're also told that counterinsurgency forces require patience, and that counterinsurgencies take a long time. The supposed lack of American strategic patience is a familiar lamentation among defense intellectuals. You'll often hear people say, well, we're just so impatient. We expect results right away. And many of, what if the presence of the counterinsurgency forces is precisely an irritant to the conflict and exacerbating it? And many people have made this case about Afghanistan. In fact, most recently, Matthew Ho, who said that they're fighting us because we're there. The other thing that troubles me about this patience argument is that it seems like a prescription for an interminable presence. So if things don't improve, well, maybe I just haven't been here long enough, or I haven't been trying for long enough, and I just need to have more strategic patience. And in fact, if you look at coin theory and doctrine, then you really can't expect a positive result for about 8 or 9 years, by which point, if it's failing, well, I'm now already in it for 8 or 9 years. So at what point am I now wasting my time? The second major problem with population-centric coin theory is that it really is nation building. It emphasizes the population, meeting its needs, establishing legitimacy, developing economies, and some very noteworthy coin adherents have emphasized the potential to change entire societies. But I think because the discussion is often wrapped up in this more exotic, abstruse language of defense wonkery, then some of these strategic trade-offs can get glossed over. So infrequently is the strategy described to the American people as, well, we can either do nation building or counterterrorism. I think if the choice was presented that way, you'd get probably a different answer. But in practice, the two things are not very distinguishable. Finally, some of the specific aspects of coin theory are intellectually and strategically problematic in themselves, and I lament that there hasn't been perhaps enough intellectual challenge to the precepts in FM 324 itself. So let me just give you a couple of examples of things that troubled me. One of the counterinsurgency dictums that you'll hear a lot is clear, hold, and build. And that this is part and parcel of an effort to win hearts and minds. And so the notion is that you clear an area of the enemy, you push all the bad guys out, and then you hold the area against their return, and then you build. And you build so that you can sustain stability for the long term. And this sounds reasonable, but I think it withers a bit under scrutiny. So what precisely are you supposed to build? Is it security forces? Is it sewage treatment plants? Is it electrical lines? And what point do you build to? And how do you know that you're building the right thing? Is there a master plan for building a society, an architecture that we're following? And if it depends, what does it depend on? There is, in fact, no end to such an approach because there's no basis on which to measure progress, much less completion. And what FM 324 says about this is commanders should prepare for a long-term effort. Indeed. Some recent research on this particular question is illuminating. Andrew Wilder at Tufts University, who has extensive personal and professional experience in Afghanistan, I think he actually grew up part of his life in Afghanistan and speaks the language, Jiz, I believe, and has gone out and he's interviewed Afghans on their perceptions of aid efforts. He says, if you spend lots of money too quickly in highly insecure areas, this often ends up fueling corruption. And it's this corruption which in turn, I think, has had a major destabilizing effect. So you bring in lots of money to build stuff, and then you end up picking winners and losers and elevating certain parts of that culture over others without probably knowing what the impact of what you're doing is. And it's probably too difficult to really get your arms around who you're helping and who you're hurting. He also says that there's a very, very limited evidence base that these aid projects are winning hearts and minds, which was the intent of a lot of this work. And my research is showing that not only is it not winning hearts and minds, but Afghan perceptions of aid and aid actors are largely negative. So by helping certain parties and being perceived as assisting a rapacious government, we're actually hurting our own effort. At the heart, another issue with counterinsurgency theory is that this notion that we must win over the population. And so the idea is that there's a small group of very bad guys, there's us, and then there's this population in the middle who isn't quite sure whose side they should be on. And so we must exert ourselves to gain their trust and get them on our side. But I think this too is deeply complicated by reality. It assumes that a foreign force such as ours, who inevitably will not be there forever, could ever truly understand, never mind penetrate and manipulate the opinions and loyalties of an ancient tribal people. But the conceit inherent in this notion goes mostly unremarked upon. Might they just use us for goodies and consort with our enemies? This would be smart of them, in fact, to do that. But I think the reality is we don't understand these societies, and we don't have large numbers of people who ever will in a sufficient degree of depth to change their loyalties. I mean, this is a huge undertaking that mostly gets glossed over in conversation. Well, we'll build them a well and they'll be on our side. Well, it's not that simple. And they have relationships and they have considerations that we'll never understand. And anybody who's served in any of these places knows that you think you know who somebody is, and then you find out, well, wait a minute, he's that guy's cousin. Or, you know, he's in that tribe and he knows that guy. And suddenly there's layers upon layers of relationships that you aren't even aware of. And maybe there's 3 or 4 people in the whole theater that could get to the bottom of that, but most of us aren't going to be able to. Finally, you know, counterinsurgency theory is awash with aphorisms and formulas that tend to convey a false certainty. There's a kind of latent determinism in it. I saw Fareed Zakaria wrote the other day that counterinsurgency advocates sometimes treat the problem of forces in Afghanistan like it's applied physics. And I think there's a strong tendency for commentators to pull quotes from FM 324 and advance them as some kind of elixir, an algorithm that merely needs to be applied. COIN advocates also often say that counterinsurgency is the graduate level of warfare, as if success is merely a matter of study, and that if one is sufficiently intelligent and studied, that it can be made to work. So putting aside for the moment the rather incredible arrogance of this claim, as if the men on Omaha Beach or Rommel or Patton were mere undergraduates in the practice of warfare, there's a mechanistic quality to the rhetoric that is, to me, weirdly at odds with its subject, the idiosyncrasies, peculiarities, and multi-million variable problem of entire societies. Yet we seem to imply that by applying a formula, we can produce an intended result. So what does this mean for US strategy? I don't want to focus too much on Afghanistan. We can talk about that in questions, but I do believe that the direction the administration goes could have a big effect on the dialogue surrounding counterinsurgency. But over the long term, counterinsurgency is already having a big effect on our debate about overall US strategy in the world. Adherents of COIN theory argue that future wars will be population-centric. Some even argue that we must fight a global counterinsurgency. I don't know if this means that we need to protect the entire population of the world, but that would be the logical conclusion. and that US forces need to be designed and prepared to deal with that. To me, the first problem with this notion is that it seems to elide or gloss over the larger questions about what wars the US should and will choose to fight. It seems to be making predictions about what adversaries will bring to us, but not what we should do about that. I think it also presupposes that the US has the necessary resources and capability to impose its will on societies into the foreseeable future. And our economic situation alone should give us great pause on this score, to say nothing of the hubris contained in this idea. Our challengers around the world haven't been standing still these last 8 years while we've been busily fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've had a great strategic pause while we've expended enormous blood, treasure, and psychic energy on these conflicts. And to now suggest that we need to do not less but more of that strikes me as a strange claim. If we make major changes to our forces and the counterinsurgency adherents are wrong, well, then this could have enormous implications on the readiness of US forces to fight the nation's wars and possibly to deter future wars. And I think we can probably safely say that they most certainly are wrong, as are any predictions about the future of warfare. Secretary Gates pointed out in a speech in 2008, precisely on this issue of uncertainty, he said that in 1920, Winston Churchill declared that there was not the slightest chance of war with Japan in his lifetime. And history is just replete with examples of completely failed predictions about the future of war. If you look at what people were saying before the Korean War, there was actually a debate about whether we needed a standing ground army. And then, oh, whoops, we had to go send them off to fight in Korea. And so we need to be quite humble about what we think we can know about the future of warfare. To me, supposing that the future of warfare is just like Iraq and Afghanistan seems a lot like fighting the last war, and precisely extrapolating the past and the present into the future. But nonetheless, you already see events moving in this direction. And yeah, I think this is challengeable, but it worries me a little that the Army decided to convert 2 of its heavy brigades, tank brigades, into lighter striker-based brigades, which might be more useful in a population-centric context. There's generally, in these circles, dim view taken of armor and other high-technology traditional tools of warfare. In my view, we're in dire need of a larger strategic conversation about the direction of US national security policy. 9/11 happened 8 years ago, and since then we've been engaged in what Steve Biddle calls a rollback strategy against extremists. So we'll go out there and we'll fight you and try to exterminate you wherever we find you in the world. And we'll convert your society so that they can never host you again. But this has turned out to be incredibly difficult and expensive. Perhaps we should consider a more modest containment strategy, as proposed by Andrew Basovich, for one among others, that recognizes the limits of US power and the potential bankruptcy of global crusading. In any event, I think we must begin by calling things by their own names in all their complexity and resist simplifications and formulas such as coin. Then we might also heed the advice of no one less than President Woodrow Wilson, ironically, who offered that the US should exercise the self-restraint of a truly great nation which realizes its own power and scorns to misuse it. With that, I'll take your questions.
Thanks very much, Celeste. I'm sure I can tell by the reactions you've stirred up a lot of questions. I raised many very, very interesting ideas. So start right in the front.
One of the particularly important questions is, what is Gates' view of all of this? Can you help us out on that?
I can't speak authoritatively about what the Secretary thinks. My sense is that he too is skeptical of predictions of the future of war. He has sort of embraced this notion of hybrid warfare I think as a mechanism to not buy wholesale into the coin theory. I think he's perhaps rightly concerned that the services will revert back to the things they like most, and wants to prevent that and ensure that he maintains a degree of innovation and flexibility. But I don't think he buys wholesale into the coin future, but I think he does some. But you've heard him talk about this war-itis versus next war-itis, and we shouldn't get next war-itis. I do think his priority is dealing with the conflicts we're in, and hard to say where his inclinations are on Afghanistan, although one reads that his inclinations are to give General McChrystal the forces that he's looking for. So, I mean, he may lean a bit more toward the coin worldview. I mean, that's my sense. Oh, sorry, you can take it.
No, it's fine.
You talked about how counterinsurgency theory is back and everybody's reading the books, but I wonder, is anybody actually reading the books? You look at Gholz. Gholz states real clearly that the counterinsurgency forces in the future must get rid of basically every airplane that doesn't have a propeller, and get rid of the entire Navy, and
Yeah.
get rid of everything.
Yeah.
And Gholz presented that as a prescription for France, and certainly there were plenty of officers like him who presented that to the Fourth Republic and to Gaulle as a prescription for French policy in Algeria. And the French army, French state was unwilling to do that to maintain an integral part of France, which Algeria was. So why the hell are we supposed to do that? Is
I'm not
anybody
sure.
reading that?
I mean, I think they are, and yeah.
To continue,
Go ahead.
everybody talks about Tabor and his war of the flea, but Tabor points out quite clearly that nobody writing then, which is writing now as well, has ever, writing about counterinsurgency, has ever been part of a successful army that defeated a counterinsurgency.
Yes. Rather noteworthy that these are all losses that we're using as examples, right? But I mean, Vietnam's a great example, right? Vietnam is one of the great narratives as part of this whole kind of body of work. And the theory is, well, we were just about to win because we had started implementing. So first there was the big ham-fisted dummies, and then the smart people came in, and we were just about to win until those chicken politicians pulled us out, right? And so this is a vast oversimplification, but the narrative you'll notice in most of the cases, so if you look at Malaya, Vietnam, and now Iraq, it's the same story over and over. Begins with brutal idiots, smart guy comes in, he implements a new, kinder, gentler, more culturally sensitive policy, and things start going well. And I mean, and all of this is a story that overlooks significant complexity, like the French were rather brutal in many cases in Algeria.
And we were extraordinarily brutal in
Yeah,
Vietnam.
right.
Curtis
So,
Air Force. But the Tabor makes the excellent point in his discussion about U.S. and Vietnam is war to what end? Isn't that the real problem of the United States in both wars?
yes.
We do not have any sort of clear, coherent war aims and war policies. That the initial war in Iraq was based on what clearly is a fair go of lies, and consequently we haven't come up with an adequate war narrative or war aim to replace it, and we have never had one in the first place in Afghanistan.
I agree with you. We have not specified our war aims, and I mean, my concern is that counterinsurgency theory is a replacement for actual aims and objectives, and I think that too often the conversation becomes one about, well, we need to do this, that, and the other thing, and build an Afghan society, and reduce corruption, and build governance, and so on, and that takes the place of actual, what are we doing here?
Exactly.
CP.
Thank you very much for visiting. First, it seems to me that you're not necessarily giving...
You want to speak a little louder?
Yes, I'm sorry. It appears to me that you're not necessarily giving a more neutral run or review of FM for the coin. First of all, it's a field manual. It has its appropriate audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know well better than most that at the most senior levels, they don't have coin on the desktop. They usually have a broad array of experts providing them with that counsel that exceeds what is actually in the field manual itself. The field manual, as you know, is intended for people that maybe have no knowledge on this subject whatsoever. focus on coin and you're focused on the critiques, taking quotes from the field manual doesn't necessarily give the neutral assessment of how that field manual actually does contribute, because it is with information contained in the field manual that people were even authorized to pay off people so that they wouldn't attack service members, or to actually start getting involved in a civil affairs mission, which, as you know, for vast part of the 80s and the 90s had been largely in a decrease in terms of funding, support, and management. That's one issue. The other issue, I think, is what alternatives would there be? I mean, if you suggest containment, the containment consists of predator attacks, which of course creates its own complications. If we don't actually have people in there trying to do a civil affairs mission, then considering that it's a landlocked nation, how else are we going to prevent people that up until 2001 have been harboring camps, extensive camps, to provide terrorists that will actually go outside their border and come here to attack us?
Okay, all right. Well, so let me start with the manual. Okay, so I don't mean to be glib here, but so to borrow a phrase, manuals don't kill people, people kill people. And I don't blame the manual. I blame the massive misuse of the manual to replace strategic thinking. The manual's okay. Personally, I don't think counterinsurgency is the right framework anyway, but okay. I'm not saying that it is, should be perforated and put on a roll or something. I mean, there's interesting things in the manual that have that, and it has some value, but it's the mass over-application, over-hyping, and overuse of the manual and the tenets of counterinsurgency that I object to. So, on your second point about if we're not doing it by mass presence, how can we do it? I think, lots of people in the debate have pointed out a number of alternatives. I don't think, well, first of all, we know that 9/11 was not actually planned and trained for solely in Afghanistan anyway. And I think we should pay attention to the arguments of people who say, look, Al-Qaeda has sanctuary in a number of places, and by the way, these guys were mostly Saudis who came from Germany, who trained in Arizona, and they got support from all different places of the world. And yes, Al-Qaeda had sanctuary in Afghanistan at that time, but it's not clear how instrumental that was to the conduct of 9/11, though I'm sure it helped. But I also don't think it's obvious that if we were to suddenly say, okay, look, we're out of here, that the automatic result would be the reestablishment of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Clearly, if we were to reduce our forces in Afghanistan, we would do so in a way that would allow us to control some of that outcome. And I think there's things we could do to control some of that outcome. By the way, there's a lot of countries in that region besides Pakistan who have an interest in Afghanistan not becoming a permanent haven, opium den, and haven for extremism. And those countries have a role to play. We could cut deals with certain parties. We could continue to have a small presence. We could continue to do strikes. There's all sorts of things we could do. The alternative can't be we abandon it entirely and give up on future 9/11s, or we have a mass presence in perpetuity. Those can't be our only choices.
Great. Maybe we should come back because there are a bunch of other questions, but you can definitely be on the list. How's that, Frank?
Thanks, Gene. So that was a really tremendous presentation. Got my mind real buzzing about a lot of things. And I'm wondering though, is this really a talk about coin? As I thought about it, really, which maybe I'm wrong about this, it strikes me as an argument about the limitations of military intervention, period. The coin is one part of this, but as you correctly point out, it's a very important lesson that people talk about coin and its effectiveness. They're maybe being disingenuous or overly simplistic. It strikes me that what you're really talking about, and maybe this is weird closeness to Eugene here, I keep feeling restraint coming over here. Isn't in fact really what your talk is about, and this is the just leave it at that, whether it's coin, whatever it is.
Right.
Sort of the first thing I throw out there is this, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I picked up something different. And I think it's important, it is, and it's important that you say that. The second thing is, there seems to be a concern in your talk about, as people embrace coin ownership, the way they structure the military and what kind of weapons they buy, and sort of as the Army moves away from tanks, it's problematic. And my mind is, okay, maybe the Army's doing these things, but as I look at what the Navy and Air Force is spending billions of dollars, I really don't see coin as a real threat. I see the opposite. These forces still look a lot like the World War II forces that you were talking about. This sudden, maybe I'm missing something here, but if I wonder how much of a concern it is that the adoption of coin is going to affect over the next 5, 10 years the structure of our forces and the kind of procurement weapon systems decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, would it be such a bad thing if that were to happen?
Yeah. Well, on your first question, yeah, I think you're right. That is the theme, that these large-scale military interventions are extremely problematic and should be undertaken only with the greatest caution, certainly now that we've learned the lesson. What I'm worried about is we didn't learn that lesson. What we learned was, oh, look, what we need is the right commander and the right concepts and the right framework, and this is doable. And so what I'm concerned about is that we may be drawing the wrong conclusions because of the prevalence of the coin narrative and the Iraq narrative, and that we precisely haven't taken away from this, wait a second, maybe these large-scale military interventions aren't really worth what we're paying for them. But since we haven't really come back to that conversation and we're talking now about, well, you know, we need to build this school here, and, you know, we need to stamp out corruption and build governance as if we know what that means in these societies. And so, I mean, I feel like I need to focus on the coin issue because that's exactly what's leading us down the wrong lesson direction on this larger issue that you point out. So that's why I focus more on the coin rhetoric. On the risks of force structure,
I was just worried in getting lost in that argument.
Yeah.
Still, someone would respond, well, there's some useful application of force in Afghanistan, just not this one. Whereas I think the implications of your argument are that there are very few, if any, useful applications of force in Afghanistan, which is a different and more important argument.
yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, fair point. On the force structure issue, you're right that the Navy and Air Force probably haven't changed their force structure that substantially, although, you know, Air Force got F-22 reduced rather substantially. You know, what does that really mean in the long term? I'm not sure I'm equipped to predict that. I do think the Army has moved strongly in this direction. I think that they have, there are large factions of the Army that have adopted these ideas. You know, what I think this might mean in terms of Army politics is you'll see sort of an ascendance of the infantry kind of light crowd, and that, you know, we might risk then ignoring some of the benefits of armor. By the way, interesting irony is that we actually used armor to huge effect in Fallujah, in Sadr City, and actually now the Canadians and the Brits have found that some of their lighter vehicles don't withstand what's happening to them in Afghanistan. So interestingly, tanks might be useful even in these contexts, but I think broadly you see a general shift toward these kind of lighter forces. And I think, you know, that's where you get into discussions about, are we effectively deterring conventional challengers now, because our conventional superiority will slowly be eroded by this focus. And, you know, people point to the Israelis in Lebanon in 2006 as an example, that they had over-focused on coin and fared very poorly in that conflict. So, I mean, I think there are some consequences. It's hard to see them now, but they may be dim, but I think they may be there.
There are many more questions. I'm going to interject one quickly on this, because you mentioned factions within the Army and different reaction to this. And I was wondering kind of what your read is on how these ideas, faith in the coin manual, questioning, confidence that the Army's interests are being represented, sort of conflict between, so-called big Army and special forces, or conflict between the corporate Army that's interested in the long term of the service and operational Army, basically represented by General Petraeus. This seems that there are a whole bunch of cleavages in the Army.
Right.
And if you would give us your insight or handicap a little bit, who's up and who's down, and how do you know?
Well, I think it's interesting because the way the argument gets cast by a lot of kind of coin adherents is if you don't buy into coin and kind of the irregular, then you're a troglodyte. And you're this conventional thinker, you haven't bought into the graduate level warfare, you're all about the past. And so I think that dynamic has sort of infected the Army and kind of made a lot of people in the Army feel like, well, I don't want to be seen as this hidebound troglodyte. I'm going to, buy into some of this. And so, rather than it being actual, real intellectual differences, it's kind of been cast in these terms. And so I think you do see, especially, a lot of younger officers thinking, okay, well, this must be the future. And I do think, as I mentioned before, what it advantages is the infantry lighter side of the Army, which is always in competition with the heavier side. I mean, this is just another manifestation of that. And I would say they're up, and they're up big time for the next few years. And it's hard to see how that changes. Even if we go down in numbers in Afghanistan, it's hard to see how that changes. So I think the reduction in emphasis in heavy forces will probably persist. But I mean, I think the leadership of the Army, I don't know exactly where they're at. I think they're, I can't speak for any of them personally, but I sense ambivalence about the direction the service should go and deep concern about the strain being placed on soldiers. I think that's a huge preoccupation right now with a lot of the Army leadership is, look, whatever we do, we got people committing suicide, we got people on heavy rotations, and it's wearing them down, and there's lots of evidence that people are starting to wear down.
Straight ahead of me, that's the next question.
Let's go back, let's try to bring all this down to a concrete level.
Okay.
3 years ago, you have to be sitting in the president's office for the big presentation, things like our new purge. Before he makes a decision, he turns to you and says, what do you think?
Okay, well, what I thought at the time and what I still think is I would have said, sir, without the Iraqi government buying into our vision, because they don't, and their concept of the future of Iraq is not the same as ours, we should consider reducing our forces further and letting the violence probably burn itself out. And, we've probably gotten out of this what we're going to get out of it, so let's try to figure out how to make as elegant an exit as we can. Which, by the way, this is what was going to happen. I mean, we were on our way to getting out of there. That was the plan. And, I think the surge had a lot of interesting political and morale consequences that weren't necessarily bad. It kind of allowed us to get out of there without feeling like it was another Vietnam or some sort of debacle or disaster. But to me, that doesn't change your kind of basic strategic situation at all. It changes how you feel about it, and that means something. But it doesn't change where we are, which I think we are where we would have been. It just would have been bloodier on the Iraqi side. But it's not clear to me that the outcome would have been fundamentally different, although that's a counterfactual that I can't prove. But, would we really have been better off or worse off substantially had we just not even done the surge? What if we had just kept moving on out? Would we have been worse off? I'm not sure.
I want to stick with new questions if I can. So I know you're very...
Research, did you look at the Russian invasion and occupation of Afghanistan to see what affected them and the I would call it insurgency. You may have different view of it. How the Afghans then fought the Russians. Did you look at it, and what lessons could we pull from their invasion, and of course why they pulled out?
Right.
I say they pulled out because they couldn't stand the heat. Much like we probably went in with a surge because the president couldn't stand the heat.
Well,
war violence. But anyway.
yeah, the
about
Russians.
the Russian invasion.
Yeah. There are people who are serious experts on this question, and I'm not one of them, but I was working on a project at RAND where we did look at this. And the interesting thing is that the Russians, if you read Russian documents at the time, you know, sometimes in the discussion people will say, oh, the Russians were all about force. They were always, you know, bombing villages, and they alienated the Afghans, and we're not going to follow their terrible example. Actually, that's not quite true. The Russians really tried to train Afghan forces, were quite serious about it, put a lot of effort into it. They tried to impose their vision of how society should be organized onto the Afghans. And they built a lot of things. I mean, if you go to Afghanistan now, there's a lot of Soviet-built buildings. Bagram Air Base was built by the Soviets. And so there's still a lot of stuff that they actually built, infrastructure that they built in Afghanistan. So it's not true to say that they were just there to beat up on Afghans. They were trying to create a society there. It just didn't really work. And I think they pulled out because it wasn't worth it to them anymore. It was costing them more than they were willing to pay. And, you know, we may get there. I don't know.
Will.
Yeah, I'm largely sympathetic to what you were saying, so I don't need to pick on this.
Go ahead.
There's a few little things, but I think largely what you say is right. I just got back from Afghanistan, I was there for a while, and there are a lot of people there that actually have similar feelings as you or thoughts. So it's not a single unitary voice there. However, that being said, one of the problems and dangers I think is it's not applied physics, I think, what you say, right? Because with applied physics, you apply the formula, you get or you don't get the result, and then you look at the evidence and you may tinker with the formula if you got it wrong, and so on and so forth. Eugene would know better than I about physics. However, I think it's more like a fundamentalist religion in the sense that it's really faith and doctrine over data and evidence.
Yeah.
And I went to the Coin Academy in Kabul.
Yeah, I've been there.
A lot of junior folks.
Yeah.
And it was like going to church except with breakout groups.
Yeah.
So I think it actually quite works. But
Yeah.
the thing I wanted to kind of push on, play the devil's advocate on this, you said, you know, how do you know what to build and so on and so forth. I mean, these are arguments about just the dangers of government planning, period. It's hard to know what you're getting, so on and so forth.
Right.
But as far as how you measure success of the clear hold build strategy, I actually think that there's an answer that someone will give you that applies this.
Okay.
And it's not a foolish answer, so I'd like to get your response, because you could say, okay, let's look at the atmospherics, like in a place like Nawa, or a place like Armsir. Let's look at the number of attacks versus ISAF or ANSF. Let's look at the number of turn-ins, or the amount of intel you're getting from locals about quote-unquote foreign forces, which in Afghanistan could be the people over the next hill. Or just look at how much glass is being installed in the area, or look at the market value of weapons in the area.
Right.
These things are going to give you some hints about how far you're advancing there.
Right.
So I don't think it's not as if there aren't some indicators.
Right. Well, I mean, you can measure those things, I agree, and they might actually tell you something about what is happening at that moment. But what you don't know is that enough to sustain stability for the long term? So let's just say that I created a Pacific little island there in some village in Afghanistan. Well, what happens when I go away? Is the answer, well, I didn't build enough because I needed to build it to withstand any further incursions? Well, then what does that mean? And so it gives you temporary indicators that actually don't allow you to achieve permanent success unless the answer is you keep coming back in perpetuity until they never come back again, which seems rather circular.
But that's what the crystal will tell you, is that we need greater force density so that when we do clear, hold, and build, we can actually stick around and do it. So the problem is leaving, not the problem of measuring.
Then this strikes me as a mission that has no end.
Right, exactly.
So then if that's the answer, if the answer to Afghanistan is a mission that has no end, let's please ask the American public if that's okay with them. I kind of suspect that's not going to work.
You want moving down the side here? Well, over here, then we'll head down. I'm moving in that direction. Please.
I understand that he's talking about measurable results, and that seems to be a measure of behavior change. And that seems a lot different than winning hearts and minds.
Right.
I'm a patriot and sense is that the goal of winning hearts and minds is really
I mean, I think it's extremely problematic, and it's been reduced to an incantation, right? It's sort of a mantra, and without really understanding what that means, we don't even understand their hearts and minds. How do we know what will win them? And I mean, this is my issue with kind of this conceit of counterinsurgency that we can ever win them over. I mean, even if you win them over temporarily, well, you know, it just may not last. You may not know exactly what their relationships are, what their priorities are, what they care about. Maybe they're not buying what we're selling. Maybe they don't want modernity. And so, I mean, I agree with you, basically. This hearts and minds issue is really problematic and ill-defined.
So now let's continue down, please.
Hi, not to take you years back on memory lane, Celeste, but at the Pentagon, what I understood to be the most basic response of the Bush administration to 9/11 was partnership capacity building.
Can you speak up a little bit? We're having trouble.
The most basic response of the Bush administration to 9/11, I understood to be governance capacity in those countries around the world where terrorist networks of global reach are present.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that failing states and failed states are very bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that everyone was pretty much on the same page that ungoverned areas
Mm-hmm.
where there were terrorist networks of global reach were particularly bad,
Mm-hmm.
and that you had to drain the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that maybe that fundamental assumption, which is sort of what ties counterinsurgency doctrine
Yeah.
together with partnership capacity building and really the whole of the policy together,
Mm-hmm.
are you saying that that assumption may not be correct?
Yes, I'm saying that assumption may not be correct. I think, I mean, there have been failed and failing states with permanent pathologies from time immemorial. And I think we should be a bit humble about our ability to fundamentally change those societies. I think we can do intel cooperation. I think we can work with them. I think we can seek to improve their security forces and make recommendations on changes to their laws. But I mean, I think one of the fallacies of partnership capacity building, where you sort of go around the world and train other forces, is that if you train them, they'll use them for what you want them to use them for. And I think we've found with experience that we can train them and we can actually make them really good, but they might use those forces in ways that we didn't have in mind. I give you the Iraqi National Police. We trained them really well, and then they were implicated in examples of Sunni sectarian violence, rather egregious examples. And so, well, we built their capacity, and it didn't get us where we wanted to go. And so I think you have to do these in small numbers and small amounts and focus on dealing with the people you can deal with rather than trying to convert them into something that they're not.
Okay, so a follow-up then, and to go
Brief.
from the Pentagon to the State Department. If it's true that ungoverned territories are not that big of a problem and that we can use a containment strategy towards them, and I'm thinking now going back to Afghanistan during the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
should we alter our understanding of sovereignty and of the legal defense of sovereign, the defense that the Taliban government had? We are a sovereign territory. Should we have said in the 1990s, no, you're not in control of your territory, therefore your claim of sovereignty is impaired, therefore we can move freely into those areas that are ungoverned in your territory?
I mean, I think if we had known that the result was going to be 9/11, sure. What else would you do? If you have an imminent threat against the United States and you know that the only way to deal with it is to violate someone's sovereignty, then maybe that's what you need to do. But I don't think you need to make a wholesale kind of theory about it. I think you can take it on a case-by-case basis.
But I wasn't talking about an imminent threat because it's a terrorist situation, so you're never going to know that a threat is imminent, right? You're
Yeah.
looking at a situation that's dangerous, it's ungoverned,
Right.
you know that there are terrorists present.
Right. We're doing this, by the way.
There's no claim of right going in there.
We're already doing this. We did this in Somalia recently. We do it when we need to do it. And in fact, exactly that targeted approach against specific threats in places seems to have worked for us. What I'm against is changing entire societies, trying to convert them, into us or some approximation of us. We just deal with the threats that we know are there.
So the gentleman in the front there.
I'd like to get back to the doctrinal split that was opened up between the Army and the Marine Corps on one side and the Navy and the Air Force, and I assume the strategic intelligence people coordination between the various services and procurement decisions?
I mean, in my mind, this is another variant or manifestation of inter-service competition. It just has different elements now. So I think I'm not sure the Marine Corps. I'm not sure that they've completely bought into this. I think they're eminently practical and will do whatever they think they need to do. But they're small. They're very tight knit. They kind of make things work, and they have successfully argued, we do this all the time. We've always done this. We don't really need to change ourselves. You want something, we'll give you a MAGTF to do it, and no further questions needed. So I'm not even sure that the Marines have fully bought into this. I mean, I think it's the Army that's really struggling with its vision of the future. But again, this is just an opportunity for the Army to get, if you look at bureaucratic competition in the Pentagon, well, the Army can argue for more resources because it needs the more immediate resources, and the Navy and the Air Force then have to fight for what's left. And I mean, it's just another element of that continuing dynamic, which is always there, I think.
Please.
Okay. Given the complex family and tribal relationships, what adaptations are being made to information gathering or intelligence to ensure that that is accurate? Because I understand that there are a number of situations where, given, as you mentioned before, relationships between individuals, tribes, and so on,
Yeah.
inaccurate information has been provided to U.S. forces, which has led to mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've gotten a lot better at this over the last 8 years. I think, you've got people who go on repeated deployments who really, understand these places a little bit better. Just more experience has made us more nuanced and more subtle about that. And I think if you looked at the way people track relationships and map those relationships, I think it's incredibly sophisticated. And I think they're really doing a good job at that. They're doing the best they can. I mean, I question their ability to ever truly influence large populations of very foreign people. That's my issue. But in terms of their level of understanding and their sophistication, I think it's remarkable now. Mistakes will always continue to be made. But, I mean, by the way, I don't blame the U.S. military for all this. I actually think this has come from a certain element of kind of the intellectual community rather than emerging specifically from the military. I think they've done a tremendous job with nearly impossible tasks and have stepped up in incredible ways to things that nobody ever trained them to do or told them they'd ever have to do. And I've seen examples of this repeatedly, but that doesn't mean that we should continue to give them a bad strategy to attempt to implement.
Follow-up question. You mentioned coin theory, you've mentioned conventional theory. Are there any other theories out there, and are there any adherents to those theories?
Well, so the new theory is something called hybrid warfare, which is a little bit like it's not hot, it's not cold, it's kind of somewhere in between, and that the future will be a complex mix where adversaries will attempt both conventional tactics and more unconventional tactics. I mean, that may be right. I'm not sure that amounts to anything more than warfare as it's always been, which is highly complicated, where adversaries will seek to blunt your advantage through asymmetric strategies. And I think that's kind of where we're back to.
In the front.
Yeah, one question. Do you see any difference between Mujahideen and Taliban in terms of ideology, personnel, geography? What is the difference between those two groups?
I'm not a huge expert on the groups in Afghanistan, but I do know that there's a great book on this called The Looming Tower, which gives a super history of
written by a famous Austinite, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, and it's an excellent look at what the relationship was between the Taliban and the Mujahideen in the 80s. And what you find is that the Afghans weren't that impressed with a lot of the Arabs that came to help them with their jihad. The Afghans didn't consider them necessarily that good of fighters. And I think there's evidence among people who are more expert on this than I am that They don't necessarily have the same aims. They don't necessarily have the same views of the world. And I mean, it's exactly this difference that people talk about trying to leverage, that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are not the same. I mean, other people say, well, now they do share objectives, but I think you could credibly argue that the Taliban is much more focused, to the extent that they're monolithic, which I don't think they are, the Taliban is much more focused on Afghanistan per se, and maybe Pakistan, where it doesn't have this kind of globalist vision, caliphate vision that Al-Qaeda does.
Okay. I think this is actually going to be our last. We're coming to the end, but please.
Looking, backing way up to the top of the hill and looking down, should we have a presence in the Mideast? A physical military presence?
That's a hard question. I'm not sure that it has worked out well for us. I think that even if you go back to the 90s, it's clear that our presence in Saudi was an enormous irritant. I'm not sure what it really got us. I think it's potentially very costly in terms of exacerbating tensions against us and views against us among, moderate Arabs. And it's not clear what exactly we get out of it. So I'm not sure I know the exact answer, but I'd make a very careful calculation of whether it was too alienating to that population, and whether, in fact, us just sort of minding our own business for a while might not allow this extremism to burn itself out. It's really not offering anything. The containment theory would say, look, these ideas have no merit anyway. Stop bothering these people and they'll see that. And I think there may be something to that.
There's the flip side of that same thing, though, which is we lose any sort of what you just described a few minutes ago, the knowledge base that gets built by the presence there, the ability to understand how things should be done, should they have to be done. And your earlier comment about whether the American people would buy onto a long-term presence, how about Germany and Japan? We've had a hell of a long presence there following a conflict. Granted, initially it was to prevent encroachment, the fear of tanks coming through the Fulda Gap, but the long-term position there has helped head off any ambitions on the parts of others, and that's the point. With a presence in the Mideast, we can push it aside, walk away from it, and then we don't know what's going to go on behind those closed walls until they come over and hit another building here or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's a question of being present as a preventional mechanism.
Yeah. Well, I think the Cold War, there was a reason for us to be in Germany and Japan. They were societies that were, certainly in the case of the Germans, we understood far better and were much more like us. And I think they had compelling strategic reasons for having us there and weren't killing Americans on a daily basis.
Right.
So, I mean, those circumstances matter a lot to me.
But so has the world changed in terms of we don't know, conventional warfare going back in history with uniformed armies coming from countries where you knew where the capital was and where their factories were. We're dealing with a whole new world now. So, we've got to have a different approach to things.
This is a great point for our exit. It's good for our exit for two reasons. First, I get to have our speaker exit on a point that I agree with, which I always like. And also, our questioner has introduced exactly the strategic debate which our speaker is calling for. We need to figure out what the United States wants and how to trade off different priorities in the United States. And that seems to be something we can all agree is worth discussing and debating. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Obviously, there are many questions left, and I'd like to invite anyone who has unanswered questions to come up here and mill around and chat for a few minutes, because we're very open. The whole point of this is to get a great discussion going. I think we had a wonderful discussion, and I hope you all will join me in thanking Celeste Ward for coming down and kicking it off with a terrific talk.